Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. My name is Helen Carter, 73 years old, and after a lifetime of building a family I believed would protect me. My son's wife locked me outside in the cold February rain. She looked me in the eye and told me to treat it as training for the coffin. That cruelty pierced deeper than the storm, but what she never realized was that I had carried $84,000 of silent sacrifice in my hands. That truth would not only break her marriage, but also set me free. The February air cut through me like a knife as I stepped out of the cab in front of the house I had called mine for more than 3 decades. My hands shook as I pulled my coat tighter, partly from the cold, partly from the weariness of the long drive back from my sister Margaret's place in Providence. It was nearly 9 at night, and all I wanted was the comfort of my bed and a hot cup of tea. The porch light was off, even though Mark knew exactly when I would be back. The darkness pressed heavy over the yard, the wet pavement reflecting the dim glow of a distant street lamp. I fumbled with my keys, my fingers stiff from arthritis and the icy air. I had turned that lock thousands of times, but tonight the key would not move. I tried again harder, my chest tightening with confusion and a creeping sense of dread. I pressed the doorbell, its familiar chime echoing through the rooms that had once held birthday parties and Christmas mornings. Through the frosted glass, I saw movement, a shadow gliding past the hallway light. Someone was home. Relief flickered for a second, but it was quickly replaced with unease as the steps paused and the door opened only a crack. Lisa stood there in her silk pajamas, her blonde hair styled perfectly as though she had been waiting for a guest more important than me. "Oh, Helen, you are back," she said flatly, her body blocking the doorway. I forced a smile, though the cold rain had started to fall harder, dampening my hair and dripping from my coat. "Yes, I tried calling earlier to let you know I was on my way." "We were busy," she said, her tone clipped. "Mark has a big presentation tomorrow." Behind her, I heard the low hum of the television, the laughter of a sitcom audience, not the focused silence of a man preparing for work. My nose caught the aroma of a roast, the very one I had prepared and frozen before leaving for Margaret's. It was a smell that once meant family, but now only reminded me of exclusion. "May I come in?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. The words felt foreign in my mouth. Asking permission to enter the house I had once paid for, decorated, raised my child in. Lisa did not step back. Instead, she leaned her manicured hand against the frame, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Actually, Helen, we need to talk about living arrangements. This house is getting too crowded with all of us here." The rain quickened drops, stinging my skin, soaking through the wool of my coat. "Can we please discuss this inside?" I asked, shivering. "It is getting very cold." Her expression did not soften. "It is better if we are direct about this. Mark and I have decided it would be better if you found your own place, somewhere more suitable for someone your age." My stomach dropped, the words sinking heavier than the rain pelting against me. "My own place," I whispered. "Lisa, I have lived here for 32 years. This is my home." "Was your home," she corrected sharply, her voice dripping with that same tone she used on Emma when explaining something obvious. "Now it is ours, and we need the space. Mark needs a proper office, and we would like a guest room for my parents when they visit." Her parents, I thought bitterly. Always her family, never mine. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, my voice nearly drowned by the pounding rain. She gave a careless shrug that felt like a slap. There are plenty of senior communities in the area. You would be around people your age. Activities support. It would be better for you anyway. Rain trickled down my face, mingling with the hot sting of tears I refused to let fall. Can I at least get some clothes, my medications? She reached behind the door and pulled out a small overnight case already packed. Your medications are in there. I thought it would be easier this way. Less dramatic. Less dramatic. As if being pushed out of my life was nothing more than an inconvenience. My hands trembled as I took the bag. What about my things, my furniture, my photographs, my books? We will sort through those later. Most of it probably needs to be done anyway. Mark says there's too much clutter. The inside of my cheek until I taste it. I need to speak with Mark. He is busy, she repeated, her eyes hard. And honestly, Helen, this decision is final. We thought about it carefully. It is what is best for everyone. The rain was now pouring in sheets, drenching me completely. My shoes squished with every shift of weight, and my gray hair clung to my cheeks. Please, I whispered, barely audible, it is pouring. Can I at least wait until tomorrow? For just a flicker, I thought I saw doubt in her eyes, a spark of conscience, but it vanished as quickly as it came. You need to learn to adapt, Helen. This is good practice. Practice for what I asked, though my heart already knew the cruelty in her answer. Training for the coffin. It is colder in there. The words stole my breath. My chest felt hollow, as if something precious had been ripped from me in that instant. I stood staring at her, a woman who had convinced my son that his own mother was disposable. Something inside me cracked. Not my spirit, but the restraint that had kept me silent. I see, I said quietly. Good, she replied, already pushing the door closed. I am glad you understand. Do not think about coming back tomorrow or calling constantly. We need space to adjust to our new normal. The door shut with a sound that echoed in my bones. I stayed there for several more minutes, the rain washing over me, my overnight bag heavy and meaningless in my hand. 32 years of memories of raising my son dismissed as easily as a pile of clutter. Finally, I turned, water dripping from my coat, my shoes squelching as I stepped off the porch. The house behind me glowed faintly through the rain-warm light spilling from windows where I no longer belonged. I walked to my car parked at the curb, my fingers slipping on the handle as I opened the door. I threw the small case onto the back seat and sank into the driver's seat, water pooling on the leather, my body shivering from cold and betrayal. The street was empty, silent, except for the steady roar of the storm. I sat there with the engine off, staring at the house through the blur of rain on the windshield. For the first time in years, I felt completely severed from the life I had built. The woman who had once been welcomed here was gone. All that remained was a mother standing in the cold rain, discarded and forgotten. I started the car and pulled away slowly, the taillights reflecting against the wet pavement, carrying me into the night with nothing but a small suitcase and the sharp ache of words I knew I would never forget. Rainwater streamed from my hair into my collar as I climbed into the car, the overnight bag heavy on the seat beside me. I sat motionless, the steering wheel slick beneath my palms, until the fogging glass forced me to act. I turned the key, the engine sputtered to life, and I pulled away from Maple Street with the sensation that I was leaving more than just a house behind. Boston glistened under the storm, its lights blurred through raindrops clinging to my windshield. I followed signs toward Copley, the wipers beating a steady rhythm each sweep, clearing only a temporary view of the road ahead. My chest ached from more than the cold. I tried not to picture Lisa's face the smug way she had told me to treat the rain as coffin practice. Instead, I thought of warmth of a safe bed for the night of any place where my existence was not a burden. The Marriott at Copley Place appeared like a beacon. The entrance glowed golden light spilling across slick pavement. A bellman hurried to open my door, but I shook my head, clutching my bag myself. I did not want anyone to see how light it was, how my life had been reduced to a few changes of clothes and a bottle of pills. Inside the lobby smelled of polished wood and fresh flowers, the hum of voices low and kind. At the desk, a young woman with auburn hair studied me. I must have looked like I had come out of a shipwreck, wet strands plastered to my cheeks, mascara smudged beneath my eyes. Her tone softened. "Good evening, Mrs. Carter. Do you have a reservation?" My voice cracked as I said no, but I needed a room, any room. She tapped her keyboard, then offered me a suite at a lower rate. I nodded quickly, sliding my card across the counter, too exhausted to question her generosity. The elevator mirrored back a version of myself I hardly recognized. A hunched figure in a drenched coat, eyes ringed with fatigue, hair hanging in wet ropes. Yet when I looked closer, I saw something new. Beneath the lines of grief, my eyes carried a glint of defiance, faint but alive. The room smelled faintly of lavender. I peeled off my wet clothes, hung the coat near the vent, and stood under the shower until steam filled the bathroom. The heat brought life back to my fingers, chased the numbness from my toes, and for the first time all evening I stopped shivering. I dressed in a clean sweater soft from years of wear and brewed the small packet of tea left by the coffee maker. I carried the mug to the window and watched the city below. Cars crept along Boylston, their headlights swimming in the rain. People rushed under umbrellas, strangers wrapped in their own nights. From here the world looked calm, detached, as though my personal storm belonged only to me. I thought of Robert, of the nights he used to bring me chamomile tea, of the way he told me to guard my independence. I whispered into the empty room, "I am trying." The tea grew cold before I touched it. Instead, I opened my purse and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. For years, I had allowed Lisa to frame herself as my benefactor while quietly draining my savings. Tonight, I would stop feeding the illusion. I dialed First Shore Bank. The hold music filled the silence, a thin melody of violins. When a woman answered, her voice brisk but warm, I steadied myself. I need to cancel some automatic payments. She asked me to verify information, then listed the accounts: the Maple Street mortgage, the quarterly property taxes, the homeowner's insurance, the car loan Mark drove for work, and the grocery delivery service Lisa insisted upon. My throat tightened as I said, "Cancel each time." She confirmed, typing quickly, and then asked if I wanted alerts on future attempts. "Yes," I said, "every one of them." By the end of the call, my heart raced, but not from fear. The weight pressing against my ribs had shifted into something sharper, something that felt like control. I wrote each confirmation number in a leather notebook Robert had once given me for grocery lists. On the first page, I wrote in careful letters February 2024. Tonight I stopped paying for their life. My phone buzzed with messages as I worked. 3 missed calls from Mark. 2 texts from Lisa. "Where are you? Stop being dramatic." The words barely registered. I flipped the phone face down and returned to my notes. I updated passwords, moved my mailing address to a box service in Cambridge, and blocked the accounts from being reinstated without my approval. The more I clicked, the straighter my back felt. At nearly 11, a knock startled me. A hotel attendant stood holding a tray with extra tea bags and shortbread. He smiled kindly, explaining that the front desk had sent them up. I thanked him, accepting the small kindness. Inside, I broke a cookie, its sweetness settling the sourness in my throat. For a moment, the room no longer felt like a stopgap, but a refuge. I walked once more to the window. Rain still fell, but softer now, tapping against the glass like a reminder rather than a threat. I imagined Lisa and Mark in the house on Maple Street, warm in the living room I had furnished, believing their life was secure. They had no idea the foundation was already gone. I whispered again, this time to myself, "You will learn." I slipped under the crisp sheets, lavender filling the air. My notebook sat open on the nightstand, its first page, a promise that tonight was the beginning of something different. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I did not feel like an intruder in my own life. When the room finally grew quiet and my breathing steadied, memories rose uninvited, as if the silence had opened a door I had been holding shut. I saw Robert again, the way he had looked in those final months before the heart attack, in the fall of 2019, sitting in his chair with the crossword folded on his knee. His absence had been a wound I thought I could not outlive. In those first weeks after his funeral, I wandered our house in Worcester, moving from room to room, trying to find him in the scent of his shirts or the sound of his shoes by the door. Mark had visited often, at first calling me every evening. He was 35, then still eager to prove himself at his firm, but he would stop by after work and eat soup with me in silence. It was Lisa who suggested that I should not stay alone. She had pressed her hand over mine and told me that loneliness could break a body faster than any illness. When Mark echoed her words, I agreed, grateful that my son wanted me near. By 2021, the arrangement seemed practical. My house was larger than theirs, but Lisa convinced me that transferring the deed to Mark would benefit us all. She spoke of tax breaks and estate planning, her voice firm, with the confidence of someone who always believed she knew better. I wanted to trust her. I wanted to trust them both. The papers were signed at a lawyer's office downtown, and I walked out telling myself that I had secured my family's future. At first, it felt almost comforting to live with them. Emma was just a toddler then, her curls bouncing as she toddled through the hallways. I spent hours singing to her, spooning applesauce into her mouth, rocking her to sleep. Mark worked long hours, and Lisa often thanked me for filling the gaps. I told myself I was needed, that my presence was a gift, but slowly the ground shifted beneath me. One evening, I cooked Robert's favorite beef stew, the recipe that had warmed our winters for decades. Lisa tasted it, forced a smile, and said it was a bit too heavy, that Mark preferred lighter meals now. The next week, she left a stack of cookbooks on my bed titles, with glossy covers promising clean eating and modern flavors. I tried. I experimented with quinoa and kale, though the dishes never felt like mine. Then came the living room. I had arranged this space years ago, with Robert choosing warm earth tones and photographs of our travels. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find Lisa directing 2 delivery men carrying in a new sectional, sleek and gray. My framed photos had been stacked in a box by the stairs. When I asked where they would go, she told me the walls looked cluttered and that the room needed a fresh start. It did not stop there. Friends I had known for decades would stop by, women from church or neighbors who remembered when Mark was in Little League. Lisa would smile politely, then later tell me that Emma needed quiet, that too many visitors disrupted her nap schedule. I began to cancel lunches, then stopped inviting anyone at all. My social world shrank until it was no larger than the square footage of that house, a house that no longer felt like mine. Mark noticed only in passing. He would come home exhausted, kiss Emma's forehead, and collapse on the couch Lisa had chosen. If I tried to raise my concerns, he would squeeze my shoulder and murmur that Lisa only wanted what was best. His words were gentle, but they dismissed me all the same. I adjusted the way one adjusts to shoes that pinch. I took smaller steps, tried not to complain. I moved my books into boxes in the basement, telling myself I would organize them later. I stopped turning on the television when I was alone, worried that the volume might disturb someone. Meals became simpler, less mine, more theirs. The clearest memory is of a Sunday afternoon in late summer. I had arranged to meet an old friend, Margaret O'Connell, for coffee. When I mentioned it at breakfast, Lisa tilted her head, her voice sweet but firm. She reminded me that Emma had a play date and that Mark would need help with the car. She said perhaps another time. I nodded, feeling the heat of shame rise in my chest, though I had done nothing wrong. I called Margaret and canceled inventing an excuse about not feeling well. That was the last time I tried to make plans without clearing them first. It was in those small moments that the truth settled in. I had surrendered pieces of myself one at a time. A recipe, a picture frame, a friendship. By the time I realized how much I had given up, I no longer recognized the shape of my days. I would lie awake at night in the bedroom down the hall, listening to muffled laughter from the living room where Mark and Lisa watched television. The glow under my door reminded me that life carried on without me, brighter and louder elsewhere. I clutched the quilt Robert and I had shared, searching for comfort, wondering when I had become a guest in the home where I had raised my son. That thought would not leave me. It grew sharper each time I was reminded to turn off lights, to rinse dishes a certain way, to schedule errands around Emma's naps. It struck hardest the evening Lisa told me that my friends were too loud, that Emma repeated the words she overheard. I had never been scolded in my own home before. Sitting now in the hotel room, warm and alone, I could finally name it. I was no longer the mistress of that house. I had become a tenant without rights, tolerated only as long as I paid in silence and service. The realization settled heavy but also clear. I could not change the years already lost, but I could decide whether to keep living as an intruder. That night, staring out at Boston's rain-slicked streets, I admitted to myself that I had been erased piece by piece until only the outline of a mother remained useful but unseen. And with that admission came something sharper still. I would not allow it to continue. I pulled the leather notebook closer to me on the desk and opened my laptop, the blue glow filling the quiet room. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, but my thoughts raced faster than any storm. For years I had avoided facing numbers, telling myself that keeping the peace mattered more than keeping track. Now I needed proof. I needed to know exactly what I had given away. I logged into my First Shore bank account, typing the password with steady fingers. The screen loaded and rows of transactions appeared, each one a small reminder of the ways I had kept Mark and Lisa afloat. The mortgage stood out first, a large deduction on the 15th of every month. $1,867 over and over, stretching back nearly 3 years. I clicked to calculate. The total made me blink. Nearly $70,000 just to hold up a roof I no longer had the right to enter. I wrote the figure carefully in my notebook, the graphite dark against the page. Then I opened the property tax portal for Worcester County. Payments of $800 4 times a year, each one taken from my account because Lisa had come to me once with tears in her eyes about how Mark's commission had slowed. 800 multiplied by 12 quarters, 9,600. My pencil moved again, the page filling with numbers that looked like accusations. Insurance was next. The homeowner's policy, $1,400 a year, quietly switched to my account. Then the car, a reliable sedan Mark needed when his lease ended. Lisa had told me it would only be a few months, that once they refinanced, they would take over. But I saw the charges now, $340 a month for 8 months straight, $2,720 and still counting. I pressed my hand to my mouth as I added groceries. Weekly bills from the delivery service Lisa favored, each one between $100 and $150. I scrolled through line after line, the numbers growing like vines wrapping around my chest. At least $20,000 over 3 years, sometimes more when they entertained. I had picked up school clothes for Emma, 2 little dresses and sneakers slipped onto my card without fanfare. I had convinced myself that grandmothers are meant to spoil their grandchildren, but this had not been spoiling. It had been survival disguised as generosity. When I added it all together, the pencil slipped in my grip. $84,000. The number stared back at me from the notebook, bold and undeniable. $84,000 of Robert's life insurance, of my savings, of the future I was supposed to protect. I had traded it piece by piece for the illusion of belonging. My throat tightened. I pushed back from the desk and walked to the window, the city lights fractured through raindrops. I thought of Robert again, of how proud he had been to pay off our first small house, how he would shake his head at the idea of signing it away. He would not have recognized the woman who had allowed herself to be erased in her own home. I whispered to him anyway, as if he might hear me. I am sorry, I see it now. I returned to the desk and underlined the number twice. Then I wrote words that seemed to come from a part of me I had forgotten. My truth. I sat staring at those 2 words until the room felt steady again. The phone buzzed on the desk. Mark's name glowed across the screen. My thumb hovered over it, but I let it go dark. He did not know yet. Lisa had hidden the reality even from him. When he finally learned, he would hear it from me, not filtered through her stories. I opened another tab and scrolled back to the first mortgage payment I had covered. I remembered Lisa approaching me in the kitchen that summer afternoon, her voice hushed, her eyes glassy. She had told me she was worried about losing the house, about what moving would do to Emma, about how devastated Mark would be if he thought he had failed. She had said it would be temporary. I had agreed because I could not bear the thought of my granddaughter uprooted. That was the start of the quiet drain, the beginning of silence that cost $84,000. I wrote the dates in the notebook, each line another step in the trail that led to tonight. Mortgage since July 2021, taxes since fall 2021, insurance since March 2022, car payments since last spring, groceries throughout. The pages filled until I had an entire map of my financial surrender. I closed the laptop and pressed both palms flat against the notebook. The leather was warm under my hands, as if it carried some of Robert's steadiness. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry. This was not a night for tears. This was a night for reckoning. Outside, the drizzle turned to mist. The city had quieted the streets below, emptying as midnight approached. I slid the notebook into the drawer of the desk, but left it open, the number visible whenever I glanced over. 84,000. My truth. I crawled into bed, the lavender of the sheets wrapping around me. The rain ticked softly against the glass, no longer cruel, only steady. I lay awake listening to the muted hum of the hotel, the distant sound of an elevator bell, the faint rush of plumbing in another room. Sleep did not come quickly, but when it did, it was filled with numbers and pages, and the image of a woman finally refusing to be erased. Morning came softly through the curtains, a pale winter light brushing the walls of the hotel room. I sat on the edge of the bed, the notebook still open on the desk, the words from last night staring at me like a vow I had already made. My tea had gone cold, but I lifted the cup anyway, just to feel something warm in my hands. The quiet of the room was heavy but not oppressive. It was the kind of silence that left space for choices. My phone buzzed again, Mark's name glowing across the screen. I let it ring once, twice, and then on the third attempt I pressed accept. His voice came rushed tight with worry. He asked where I was, if I was safe, if I needed money. His words tumbled over one another as though he had rehearsed them all night. I told him I was in Boston at a hotel, that I was fine. I told him I had food warmth and medicine. There was a pause before he asked the question I knew was coming. Why did you leave without telling us? I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers against my temple. I said I hadn't left by choice, that Lisa had turned the lock and handed me a bag on the porch. I repeated her words exactly about training for the coffin. My voice did not shake, though my chest tightened as I said it aloud again. Mark drew a sharp breath. He said that couldn't be right, that Lisa would never say something so cruel. Maybe I had misheard. Maybe she had been joking badly. Maybe the rain and the dark had distorted things. He said I had to know Lisa was under pressure, that she had been stretched thin with Emma and with his deadlines. I let him speak, hearing the rhythm of his excuses. They were familiar, the same rhythm I had used for years when justifying her dismissals, her corrections, her small cruelties. I told him no, I had not misheard, and that I had stood in the cold long enough to be certain. I told him the door had closed in my face. He tried to smooth it over, saying there had been misunderstandings before, that maybe Lisa had thought I was staying with Margaret another night. He said she probably panicked and handled it wrong. He kept saying wrong instead of cruel. I let the silence hang until he finally asked if I would come home. I looked at the rain streaking across the window pane and said no. I told him I needed time to think. He grew quiet, his voice smaller, asking if I was angry with him. I said I was not angry, just tired. He shifted quickly, asking about my medicine, my coat, if I had money. His concern touched me in a way that made my throat ache, but I would not let that soften the truth. I said I was cared for, that I was safe. I promised I would call him later. When we ended the call, I sat for a long time staring at the phone. The screen dimmed, but the weight of the conversation did not fade. He was clinging to a story that kept him from seeing the truth. I knew then that my silence had become part of that story. By protecting him from the financial reality, I had made it easier for Lisa to control both of us. I pulled the notebook closer and flipped to the page with the number. 84,000. My truth. It stared back like a verdict. I whispered aloud, "You will tell him?" For the rest of the morning, I gathered proof. I logged into my bank account again, printing records of mortgage payments, tax transfers, insurance premiums, car payments, grocery deliveries. Each line added weight to the stack of papers. I organized them in order, slid them into a plain envelope the hotel staff provided, and placed it next to the notebook. My hand rested on it as if to test its strength. At noon, my phone buzzed with another call. This time I answered before it could go to voicemail. Mark's voice was softer now, strained. He said Lisa was upset that she had told him I left suddenly, that she didn't know why. He sounded torn, caught between two stories. I told him again that I had been locked out, that Lisa had made it clear she wanted me gone. He hesitated, then asked if I could at least meet with them to talk it through. I said not yet. I said I needed one day to gather myself. He pressed, saying Emma kept asking for me, that she missed her grandmother. I closed my eyes at the mention of her name. That had always been Lisa's tool to use Emma as a tether to keep me compliant. I said gently that I missed Emma too, but that love for a child should not be used as leverage. Mark went silent. When he finally spoke, his tone was pleading. He said, maybe we could find a compromise. Maybe set rules for the kitchen or the common rooms, maybe work out a schedule so everyone felt comfortable. I felt something cold settle inside me. A schedule for me to exist in my own house. I told him no, that I would not negotiate for scraps of belonging. He fell quiet again, then asked if he could see me tomorrow. I agreed. We settled on a cafe in Cambridge neutral ground, a place with small tables and wide windows. He promised to come alone. I did not believe Lisa would allow it, but I wanted him to hear the truth without her voice cutting in. After the call, I brewed another cup of tea and sat by the window. The city moved on beneath me, cars hurrying through puddles, people carrying umbrellas. My chest still ached, but the decision felt steady now. Tomorrow I would put the envelope on the table in front of him. Tomorrow I would say the number out loud. As the light dimmed into afternoon, I took a walk down Boylston. The air was sharp but clean after the storm. I bought a simple sandwich and ate it while watching passers-by. Life outside Maple Street seemed wider, less suffocating. I thought of Robert, of how he had always said, truth has a weight, but also a freedom. I whispered to him as I walked back to the hotel, I am ready to carry it. Back in the room, I placed the envelope and the notebook side by side on the desk. I touched them both like a ritual. The paper inside felt heavier than it was heavy with years of silence and sacrifice. But tomorrow it would speak for me. I turned off the lamp and lay down my body, finally surrendering to exhaustion. The city hummed beyond the window, steady and indifferent, but I no longer felt erased. The morning after felt clearer, as if the storm had swept something out of me. I sat at the small desk in my hotel room notebook, opened the envelope of statements beside it. The words from last night still echoed in my head, but now I knew I could not carry this alone. I needed someone who loved me to remind me I was not imagining things, that what had happened was real and wrong. I dialed Margaret's number before I could talk myself out of it. My sister answered on the second ring, her voice brisk with worry. "Helen, where are you?" I told her I was safe at a hotel downtown, that I had been there since Sunday night. She pressed for details, and I gave them to her, each one tasting bitter as it left my mouth. I described Lisa turning the lock, the porch light deliberately off the bag thrust into my hands, and the words about the coffin. Margaret went silent, then let out a sound like a growl. "Helen, that is abuse. Do you hear me?" Not a misunderstanding, not tension. Abuse. I bit my lip until I tasted metal. She demanded to know how long it had been this way, and for the first time I said it all out loud. 3 years of mortgage payments, taxes, insurance, groceries, clothes for Emma, the car, $84,000 in silence. Her gasp was sharp and raw. "My God, Helen, do you realize what this is? They've been draining you? That's financial abuse." She said the words with a certainty that left no room for me to make excuses. Tears blurred my vision, but they were not from shame this time. They were from relief. Someone else saw it. Margaret's voice softened, but the steel remained. "You have to stop right now? No more payments, no more pretending. You deserve a life not chains dressed up as family duty. She promised me she would drive to Boston if I needed her, that I would not face this alone. I whispered that I was grateful that hearing her say the word abuse made it real in a way I could not deny. After we hung up, I sat very still, letting her fury steady me. My sister had always been my mirror, the one who told me truths even when I did not want to hear them. Now she had given me the gift of certainty. I decided to step outside to breathe air that was not heavy with memories. The hotel lobby was warm with the smell of coffee and pastry. As I crossed toward the door, a familiar figure appeared, tall and broad-shouldered, carrying a paper bag in one hand. It was Bill Miller, my old neighbor from Maple Street who had retired from the Boston police a couple of years ago. He recognized me instantly. "Hell and well I'll be. What are you doing here?" His voice was friendly, but his eyes scanned my face with concern. I forced a smile, then lowered my voice. "Bill, did you see what happened the other night?" His expression changed, the easy humor slipping away. He nodded slowly. "I was out with my dog. I saw you standing there in the rain." I heard Lisa's voice. His jaw tightened. "She didn't let you in, did she?" I shook my head. He looked at me for a long moment, then said firmly, "Helen, that's not just wrong. That could be considered unlawful. You lived there, your belongings are still there. Locking you out like that could be seen as an illegal eviction." Hearing those words from him made my knees weak. For so long I had doubted myself, convinced that maybe I was exaggerating. But here was a man trained in law telling me what I had felt in my bones. I swallowed hard and whispered, "You really saw it." "I did," he said, his voice steady. "I heard enough to know what was happening. If you need me to put it in writing, I will. If you need me to speak to someone official, I'll do that too." His hand rested on my arm, grounding me. No one deserves to be treated like that, Helen. The tears came fast, not from sorrow, but from the sudden release of carrying the truth alone. I told him thank you, that he had no idea how much it meant to hear that I wasn't crazy. He gave a small nod. "You've always been one of the strongest people I know. Don't let them make you doubt that." When he left, I lingered in the lobby, the hum of strangers around me. For the first time in years, I felt a wall of support behind me. Margaret's fury, Bill's calm authority, family and society both telling me I was not invisible. Back in my room, I sat at the desk again and opened the notebook. Under the words, "My truth," I added 2 more, "not alone." The pencil pressed deep into the page, the letters dark and final. I stared at the phrase until my heartbeat slowed. The shame that had clung to me for years loosened its grip. I was not just a burden shuffled around at Lisa's convenience. I was a woman who had given too much and finally learned to stop. That night, I allowed myself a full meal from room service, something I had not done in years, without guilt. As I ate, I thought of Margaret's voice and Bill's steady eyes. Their strength flowed into me like warmth. I knew the days ahead would not be easy, that Mark would resist, that Lisa would fight, but I no longer felt cornered. I had allies. I had truth written down and witnesses willing to speak. When I lay down to sleep, the envelope of documents sat on the nightstand, the notebook on top of it. The words I had written glowed in my mind. My truth. Not alone. I turned off the lamp and closed my eyes, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel erased. The morning carried a different kind of quiet, the sort that felt purposeful instead of empty. I had spent the night replaying Margaret's fierce words and Officer Miller's steady confirmation, and together they formed a backbone I had not felt in years. My truth was written, but now it needed to be guarded. I could not let Lisa twist it or let Mark's blindness undo it. So I picked up the phone, searched the local listings, and scheduled an appointment with an elder law attorney named Richard Brooks. The receptionist's calm voice told me he specialized in financial exploitation cases. Just hearing those words made my stomach tighten. The office sat in a red brick building off Boylston Street with tall windows that let in strips of weak winter sunlight. Inside the waiting area was tidy and smelled faintly of lemon polish. I held my envelope close to my chest, as though someone might try to snatch it away. When Brooks appeared, he was a tall man in a navy suit, his handshake firm but not rushed. He guided me into his office where books lined the walls and papers lay stacked in deliberate order. I started slowly giving him the broad strokes of my life since Robert's death. He listened without interrupting, his pen still on the desk, his gaze steady. When I reached the night Lisa turned me out, the porch light off, the rain soaking my coat, his jaw tightened. "Mrs. Carter, that was unlawful. Locking someone out of their residence without due process is considered an illegal eviction in Massachusetts." His words struck like a gavel. I had known it felt wrong, but hearing the legal term gave it teeth. Then I pushed the envelope toward him. Inside are 3 years of records: mortgage, taxes, utilities, groceries, car payments. He opened the flap, scanned the pages, and let out a slow breath. "This is substantial. More than substantial. You've effectively subsidized their household." He nodded my throat dry. $84,000 in total. He looked up at me, his expression both professional and protective. "Mrs. Carter, this is financial exploitation. It may not have started as such, but over time it has become systematic. The law recognizes this, especially given your age and the imbalance of power in your home." For a moment I could only stare at my hands. My fingernails dug into my palms until I forced them to relax. What do I do now? He leaned forward. "First, you cut off all financial support immediately. No more mortgage payments, no taxes, no utilities, nothing. These are not your obligations. Second, we secure what remains yours. Tell me about your retirement and insurance." I explained that I still had Robert's 401k and a life insurance payout that I had guarded carefully. He nodded. "Good." "We need to firewall those." He drafted authorization forms explaining each step. His pen scratched steadily, and then he slid the first sheet across the desk. "This cancels the automatic transfer to the mortgage company." I signed. My hand shook but steadied by the second line. The next canceled property tax withdrawals. The third canceled the insurance premium I had been covering. With every signature, I felt a cord snap. 3 years of silent obligation falling away stroke by stroke. Brooks watched me with quiet approval. "This is more than paperwork," he said. "This is you reclaiming authority over your own life." He asked whether Mark had direct access to any of my accounts. "No," I said firmly, and relief flickered in his eyes. "Good. That makes the process simpler." He advised me to move my remaining funds into an account only I could access, and suggested appointing Margaret as a trusted contact, someone the bank could call if suspicious requests ever came through. The thought of my sister's name on my account filled me with both sorrow and comfort. She had always been my protector. We discussed next steps. He said he would draft a formal letter to Mark and Lisa stating clearly that I had ended all financial contributions and that any further attempts to pressure me would be considered harassment. He offered to send copies to their bank as well, to stop Lisa from trying to claim she had authority she did not. I felt both dread and relief at the idea. A letter like that would strip away the last veil, leaving only truth. When the stack of forms was complete, he slid them back to me. Each page bore my name, ink dark and decisive. I stared at the signatures for a long time, then folded them into the envelope. My chest felt lighter, though a tremor still ran through me. Brooks gave me his card and said firmly, "If they contact you, if they threaten or guilt you, you call me. You are not alone in this anymore." As I stepped outside, the wind bit at my cheeks, but the light seemed sharper. I walked past shop windows gleaming with displays and let the city's noise steady me. For years, I had been paying, silently convincing myself it was duty. Today, I had signed away that silence. Back in the hotel room, I spread the papers on the bed. My name lined the pages like a litany. I touched each one and whispered to myself, "It's done. No more." I made tea and sat at the window, the city lights flickering to life as dusk crept in. Cars hissed on wet pavement, and people hurried home with bags of groceries. For the first time in a long while, I felt I had a home too, even if it was just a hotel room, because it was a place where my will mattered. I opened the notebook once more and wrote under, "My truth signed, sealed mine again." Then I closed it and set it on the nightstand. The quiet of the room was no longer suffocating. It was freedom stretching out, waiting for me to claim it fully. The days that followed felt strangely calm to me, though I knew the ripples of what I had signed in Attorney Brooks's office were beginning to spread through Mark and Lisa's home. I no longer woke to the weight of unpaid obligations resting on my chest. Instead, I sat by the window of my hotel room sipping tea and waiting. The silence did not last long. The first call came on a Tuesday morning. My phone buzzed with Mark's name, his voice tumbling into my voicemail before I could decide whether to answer. "Mom, I don't know what's happening. The bank called me. They said the mortgage payment bounced. Can you please call me back?" His tone was nervous, but not yet panicked, as if he believed this was a simple oversight. By that evening, there were 3 more messages. He said he had checked with Lisa, that she assured him everything was fine, but then the insurance company called asking about a canceled policy. His voice grew thinner with each recording. "Mom, did you change something? Did you move money around?" I turned the phone face down on the nightstand and walked away. For 3 years, I had lived at their mercy, tiptoeing around Lisa's moods, watching Mark shrink into excuses. Let them taste uncertainty now. On the second day, Lisa's voice finally pierced the silence. Her message was sharp-laced with fury. "Helen, whatever stunt you're pulling, it has to stop. Emma doesn't understand why the lights might go off or why her home isn't safe. You're scaring her. You're hurting your granddaughter." The manipulation was familiar, but this time it felt hollow. I deleted the message without listening twice. Calls multiplied. A polite woman from the mortgage company left a message reminding Mark and Lisa that their account was now overdue, late fees accruing daily. A man from the insurance office confirmed that the cancellation had been processed, warning of lapses in coverage. Their voices were professional, but I knew each message landed like a hammer inside Mark's house. That night, I pictured Lisa's face as she realized she had no invisible hand covering her mistakes anymore. I could almost hear her trying to spin it, insisting there had been some bank error while Mark stared at statements that said otherwise. On the 3rd day, my phone rang again, and for reasons I cannot fully explain, I answered. Mark's voice was raw, stripped of composure. "Mom, I saw it." I went through the statements. He stopped, drawing a shaky breath. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, the insurance, even the groceries. It was you. It's always been you. I let the silence hold him there. Finally, I said quietly, "Yes, Mark. It was me. $84,000 in 3 years." He whispered the number back as if repeating it might make it less true. 84,000. His voice broke. Lisa told me we were fine. She said we were careful, that she was managing everything. I thought we were saving. He sounded smaller than I had ever heard him, my son, who once carried himself with the bravado of youth, now deflated by math he could not deny. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice rising. "Why would you keep this from me?" I closed my eyes. Because Lisa begged me not to. She told me you needed to believe you were providing, that it would crush your pride if you knew I was paying. She said she was protecting you. Mark made a low sound, half groan, half sob. "Protecting me," he repeated bitterly. She was protecting herself. He fell silent, and in that gap I could almost hear the weight of 3 years crashing down on him. My son, blinded by his wife's assurances, forced to see the truth in black and white. More messages arrived after that call, Lisa switching tactics, painting me as vindictive, cruel, abandoning them out of spite. She said I had betrayed family, that Emma would suffer. Each voicemail dripped with false concern, but I no longer bent under her words. I saved them, each one, a record of her desperation. That evening, I set my phone on speaker and played the latest bank message while I sipped tea. A calm male voice explained that if payment was not received by Friday, the loan would be referred to collections. I imagined Mark hearing the same message, his stomach dropping. The life they had built on my silence was cracking apart. For years, I had been the invisible backbone of their household. Now that spine was gone and the weight collapsed onto their shoulders. Watching it from a distance filled me not with guilt, but with clarity. Mark called again late that night. His tone was different, less panicked, more hollow. "Mom, I don't know what to do. Lisa won't talk straight with me. She says you're exaggerating, but I've seen the numbers." He paused, and I waited. I don't understand how I let this happen. I wanted to comfort him, but I also wanted him to sit in that discomfort, to feel what I had felt for years. I said gently, "You didn't see it because you didn't want to. You believed what was easier." He sniffed hard, but he didn't argue. I ended the call with a simple truth. "Mark, the bills are yours now. They always were." When I hung up, I walked to the window. The city lights shimmered against the dark sky cars sliding past on wet pavement. My reflection stared back at me, older, tired but steadier than before. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift. The truth was no longer mine alone. It lived in bank statements, in voicemails, in the cracks spreading through Mark's marriage. I turned off the light, letting the room fall into calm darkness. Tomorrow would bring more calls, more anger, maybe even more pleas. But tonight I knew that the silence I had carried was broken forever. I chose a quiet cafe in Cambridge, one tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop where the windows fogged in the winter air. It was a place Robert and I had once visited on our Sunday walks, and I wanted the familiarity to steady me. I arrived early, ordered black coffee, and laid my notebook flat on the table. The pages were marked with neat columns, each line a record of years I could never reclaim, and at the bottom the total that had become both a wound and a weapon. When Mark walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. His hair looked uncombed, his shirt wrinkled as if he had slept in it. He spotted me by the window and hesitated before sliding into the chair across from me. His hands gripped together on the table, knuckles white. The server brought him coffee, and for a long moment we just sat in silence. Then he finally spoke, his voice tight. Mom, I need to see it. I turned the notebook toward him, my finger steady as I traced the first line. Mortgage payments. $1,800 a month for 26 months. Then property taxes nearly $4,000 a year. Insurance premiums, utilities during the winter's groceries. Emma's school clothes, the car you drive to work. Every line was there, black ink on white paper, undeniable. Mark leaned closer, his eyes darting from number to number, his lips moving as if trying to keep up. His breathing grew uneven. He flipped a page, then another, and when he reached the end, he froze. His voice cracked. 84,000. I met his eyes. Yes. $84,000 over 3 years. His hand flew to his mouth and he repeated the number again and again like a man trying to make sense of a nightmare. 84,000. Lisa told me we were fine. He whispered, his voice breaking. She told me we were careful, that she was good with money. She said we were even saving. He pressed his palm to the notebook as if to test whether the ink would smear and prove false. I spoke quietly but firmly. She lied, Mark. She lied to you, and I let her because I was afraid of losing you. His shoulders sagged, his face pale. I didn't know, Mom. I swear I didn't know. His words tumbled out raw and frantic. I thought we were building something real, that I was providing for my family. But it wasn't me. It was you. Tears welled in his eyes. He shook his head, then covered his face with both hands. The cafe around us carried on with quiet chatter, spoons clinking against mugs, but at our table time felt stalled. My son wept like the boy I remembered, the boy who once scraped his knees and came running to me for comfort. I reached across and touched his arm. Mark, I did this because I loved you, because I loved Emma. But love is not the same as silence. Silence only protected Lisa's lies. He lifted his head, his cheeks streaked wet. She told me not to ask questions. She said she could handle the bills better than me, that it would upset me to see the details. And I believed her. I let her keep me blind. You wanted to believe her, I said softly. It was easier than facing the truth. His jaw trembled and he swallowed hard. How could I let her do this to you? How could I not see? You didn't do it to me, I answered. She did. But you let her, and that hurt more than the money. He covered his face again, his shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for every night you felt like you didn't belong in your own home. For every bill you paid while I thought I was the man of the house. His apology broke open something in me, a mix of grief and relief. I closed the notebook, folding the truth back into silence for the moment. You can't change what's been done, Mark, but you can choose what happens now. He wiped his eyes on his sleeve, his voice ragged. She can't hide from this anymore, not from me. We sat together as the afternoon light shifted, neither of us touching our coffee. He picked up the notebook again, flipping through the pages, slowly whispering the total under his breath, as if trying to absorb it. 84,000. The words sounded heavier each time, like chains falling from my shoulders and wrapping around his instead. Finally, he looked at me with a hollow gaze. My marriage. It was built on this, wasn't it? On your money, on her lies. I held his gaze steady. That's for you to decide. But you can't build something strong on a foundation of secrets. He nodded, his eyes filling again. His voice cracked as he whispered, I don't know if I can forgive her. I pressed his hand gently. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. Don't forget Mark. The numbers don't lie. He sat back, the weight of the notebook heavy in his lap, his tears drying but leaving his face hollowed. He looked both younger and older at once, a man undone by truth, yet finally seeing clearly. As he whispered one last time, "I'm sorry, Mom." I knew the walls Lisa had built were beginning to crumble, not because I pushed them, but because the truth itself was too heavy to hold. Mark asked if I would agree to meet with him and Lisa together someplace neutral where everything could finally be said aloud. I agreed, though my stomach knotted at the thought. He chose a small Italian restaurant near Kendall Square, the same one where we had celebrated his promotion years ago. Back then, the air had been filled with laughter and toasts. Now it was heavy with tension. I arrived first and asked for a quiet booth near the back. The waiter set down a candle in a small glass holder, its flickering light exaggerating the shadows on the brick walls. I laid my notebook on the table in front of me, the same one that had reduced my son to tears days earlier. I knew it would be the anchor of this meeting. Mark arrived looking worn and restless. His shirt was untucked, his tie shoved in his jacket pocket. He kissed my cheek quickly, his eyes avoiding mine. Minutes later, Lisa entered immaculate as always, her hair styled, her coat expensive, her chin held high. She sat across from me and looked first at Mark, searching for an ally, then at the notebook. We ordered coffee because it was easier than food. No one planned to eat. Lisa broke the silence first, her tone deceptively calm. "Helen, I know you've been upset, but this has gotten out of hand. Mark and I need clarity, not accusations." I opened the notebook slowly, letting the sound of the pages turning echo between us. "These are not accusations," I said. "These are payments. Mortgage, property taxes, insurance, groceries, clothing for Emma, even the car." I tapped the page where the total stood out in bold numbers. 3 years, $84,000. Lisa scoffed, though I could see her fingers tighten around the edge of the table. "You insisted on helping." "We never asked for all of this." Mark leaned forward, his voice raw. "Stop, Lisa. I saw the statements. You told me we were saving. You told me everything was fine." She shook her head quickly, her voice rising. "I was protecting you. I didn't want you to feel like a failure." Helen offered because she wanted to. "Isn't that right?" Her eyes snapped to me, daring me to agree. I kept my voice steady. "I offered because you came to me in tears saying the mortgage was too much, that Emma would suffer. You asked me, Lisa." "Every time." Mark slammed his hand lightly against the table, his eyes burning. "Did you really ask her to keep it from me? Did you really tell her I couldn't know?" Lisa faltered, searching for words. "I thought it was better that way. You're not good with money, Mark. You get anxious. I carried that burden so you wouldn't have to." Mark's face reddened, his voice breaking. "You carried nothing. She carried it. My mother carried all of it." For a moment, Lisa's mask cracked, her lips trembling, but she rallied quickly, her tone turning sharp. "She is exaggerating. She forgets things, Mark. You know that." Before I could answer, a voice came from behind me. "Janet." Lisa's younger sister had slipped into the restaurant, her coat still buttoned, her face pale but determined. She asked quietly if she could join us, and Mark gestured her to sit. Lisa hissed, "What are you doing here?" Janet's eyes did not leave her sister's. "I'm here because I'm tired of watching you lie." She turned to Mark. "She bragged to me more than once that your mother paid everything. She called it her little secret, the safety net you would never know about." Lisa's face drained of color. "That's not true," she stammered. Janet's voice stayed calm but firm. "Yes, it is. You laughed about how clever you were, how Helen would never stop, because she was too afraid of losing you both." Mark stared at Lisa, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His voice shook as he spoke. 3 years, $84,000 from my mother. While you told me we were fine. While you let me believe I was the provider. Lisa reached for his arm, tears now streaming down her face. I did it for us. For Emma. For the life we wanted. Don't let her turn you against me. Mark pulled his arm away, his voice rising. No, you did it to protect your lifestyle. The house, the car, the dinners, all of it built on lies. He shook his head, his voice hoarse. This marriage is broken. The words hung in the air like a final sentence. Lisa gasped as if struck. She tried again, her tone pleading now. Mark, please don't do this in front of them. We can fix it. We just need time. Mark pushed his chair back, the scrape loud in the hushed restaurant. He stood, his eyes glassy but resolute. No, Lisa. We can't fix something that was never real to begin with. He looked at me for a brief moment, then turned and walked toward the door. Lisa's sobs grew louder as she reached after him, but he didn't turn back. Janet sat frozen, her hands clasped in her lap, her expression grim but unsurprised. I rose slowly, sliding the notebook back into my bag. Lisa stared at me, her face streaked with tears, her mouth opening as if to hurl blame, but no words came. I left her there, sitting alone at that table with the candle flickering weakly between us. Some truths are so heavy that no amount of denial can keep them from crushing what they rest upon. The restaurant door had barely swung shut behind Mark when I knew there was no going back. Lisa sat frozen at the table, her hand still outstretched toward the empty space where he had been, her lips moving without sound. I didn't stay. I slipped my notebook back into my bag, stood and walked out into the cool Boston night. The air felt sharp against my cheeks, bracing, almost cleansing. For the first time in years, I did not feel the need to look over my shoulder. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability. Mark called me the next morning, his voice hollow but steady. He told me Lisa had packed a suitcase overnight, dragging Emma with her, and caught a flight to Arizona where her parents lived. There had been no dramatic farewell, only the echo of slamming doors and the sound of Emma crying as she was hustled out. Mark said Emma looked back at him with confusion and fear, and his voice cracked when he admitted he didn't know when he would see her again. I listened, my heart aching for my granddaughter, but I also knew that sometimes distance is the only thing that clears the fog. Lisa leaving was not abandonment of her child. It was an admission that she had lost her grip on the life she thought she controlled. By the end of that same week, Mark told me he had contacted an attorney. 2 days later, he confirmed he had filed for divorce. He did not dramatize the decision. His words were simple. Mom, I can't build a marriage on lies. Hearing him speak with such clarity was both heartbreaking and a relief. I wanted to wrap him in my arms the way I had when he was little, but I also knew this was his step to take alone. While Mark began dismantling his marriage, I began building a new life for myself. I had already started searching for an apartment, and I found a modest 1-bedroom in Cambridge, tucked inside a brick building covered with ivy. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, handed me the keys with a smile and told me the neighbors were quiet. I carried my few boxes inside and stood in the empty space, the hardwood floors glowing under the light. It was small, yes, but it was mine. I spent my first night there sitting on the floor with a carton of chow mein and a paper cup of tea. The silence of the room pressed in, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of possibility. I slept on a borrowed mattress, the air cool and clean, no footsteps outside my door, no muffled conversations judging my presence. Over the next week, I furnished the apartment piece by piece. I bought a second-hand sofa in deep gray, a dining table that could seat 4, though I rarely needed that many chairs, and a lamp with a soft golden glow. And then I saw it, the chair that made me laugh out loud in the middle of the store. It was bright yellow, bold, and cheerful, and it reminded me of sunlight after a storm. I bought it instantly and placed it by the window where the afternoon light poured in. That chair became my sanctuary. I started building rituals around it. Mornings with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. Afternoons with a novel I had always meant to read. Evenings with tea as I watched the lights of Cambridge flicker to life. I felt myself settle into the rhythm of a life that belonged only to me. Margaret came to visit one Saturday, bringing homemade muffins and flowers. She looked around, her eyes taking in the small but warm space. "You look lighter here," she said softly, and I knew she was right. I no longer bent myself into smaller shapes to fit someone else's rules. I was enough exactly as I was. As I began to breathe easier, Mark's updates arrived like slow but steady beats. He told me Lisa had refused to return to Boston, claiming she needed to be near her family in Arizona. Custody discussions would follow, but he had already decided Emma would stay with him during the school year. He admitted he had cried himself to sleep more than once, but each morning he woke with the certainty that ending his marriage was the only path left. One evening after I had returned from a long walk along the Charles River, my phone buzzed with a message from him. "Mom, I filed the official paperwork today. The divorce is in motion." I sat in my yellow chair, phone in hand, letting the words sink in. It wasn't joy that I felt, nor was it sadness. It was confirmation. The structure that had been crumbling for years had finally collapsed. What had once weighed heavily on my shoulders was now being carried where it belonged. I thought back to the night Lisa had locked me out in the rain, her words sharp as knives. Consider it training for the coffin. In that moment, she believed she had crushed me. But now she was the one who had lost the home, the marriage, the trust. Karma, in its quiet way, had worked faster than I could have planned. I closed my eyes and whispered to the empty room. It's done. The life I had been forced into was behind me. Ahead lay days filled with my own choices, my own laughter, my own peace. The apartment glowed in the lamplight, the yellow chair bright against the corner. I reached for the book on the side table, feeling a small smile tug at my lips. For the first time in a very long time, I belonged entirely to myself. A half-year passed before the next turning point arrived, and those 6 months reshaped my life more than the last 3 years combined. The days settled into a rhythm in my Cambridge apartment, quiet mornings in my yellow chair, evenings walking along the Charles, weekends visiting with Margaret, or attending the little book club I had joined at the library. Each routine felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had long abandoned. But beneath the peace, there was a longing, a hope that Emma had not forgotten me. The answer came in my mailbox one Thursday afternoon. The envelope was pale blue, the handwriting clumsy, the letters large and crooked. It was Emma's. Inside was a photo of her leaning over a cake dotted with 6 candles, her grin wide and one tooth missing. In bold letters she had written, "Grandma, I am 6 now." Next to the photo was a note from Mark. "Emma misses you every day. So do I. I am sorry for everything. When you are ready, we would love to see you again. No strings attached." I sank into my yellow chair, clutching the photo, tears spilling before I could stop them. Relief surged through me not just because my granddaughter remembered me, but because my son finally understood the depth of what had been lost. That night, I placed the photo on my bedside table where I could see it first thing in the morning. 2 days later, I called Mark. He answered on the first ring, his voice steadier than it had been in years. He told me Emma was thriving in school, that she had made new friends, that she often asked when she could see me. He explained that custody had been settled quietly, Emma spending the school year with him while Lisa remained in Arizona with visits during school breaks. He spoke of it with quiet determination, not bitterness, as if he had finally accepted that his future no longer included his wife. He asked if I would like to see Emma the following Saturday. The joy that rose in me was so immediate I had to steady my breath. Yes, I told him, please tell her I cannot wait. The morning of our reunion dawned crisp and bright, the first hints of spring stirring the air. I walked to the park near the Charles River where we had agreed to meet. I spotted her first barreling across the grass in her pink jacket, her small legs pumping furiously, hair flying behind her. She called out Grandma and threw herself into my arms with a force that nearly knocked me backward. I held her tightly, burying my face in her hair, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo. She was warm and alive, and heavier than I remembered her heart pounding against mine. For a long moment I could not speak. I could only hold her while tears streamed down my cheeks. Mark stood a few feet away watching us with quiet eyes that glistened. The afternoon passed in a haze of joy. Emma begged me to push her higher and higher on the swings until her laughter rang across the park. She skipped between us down the path, gripping my hand, and Mark swinging our arms with unfiltered happiness. We shared ice cream on a bench, the chocolate dripping down her chin as she chattered about her teacher, her friends, her favorite book. At one point, she leaned against me and asked softly why I had been gone. My throat tightened. I told her gently that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes it takes time to make them right. She studied me with wide eyes that mirrored her father's, then nodded solemnly. "Can I come to your apartment to see your yellow chair?" she asked. I promised she could. As the sun began to dip, Mark walked with me back toward my building. Emma skipped ahead, chasing pigeons across the sidewalk. Mark slowed his steps and spoke quietly. "Thank you for forgiving me, Mom." I shook my head. Forgiveness is a journey, I told him, but love never left. What matters is that we build something honest now. His expression softened, the lines of stress easing, and for the first time in years, I saw peace in his face. That night, I sat once more in my yellow chair, Emma's photo in my lap. I thought about the night Lisa had locked me out in the cold rain, her cruel words echoing like a curse. Consider it training for the coffin. She had believed she ended me that night. Instead, that night had marked the beginning of my rebirth. Because what truly broke her grip was not just the storm outside, but the storm of truth I carried inside, $84,000 of sacrifice laid bare for my son to see. It wasn't just the cold rain that night. It was the $84,000 truth that finally broke their marriage. That number had carried weight, but the deeper truth was heavier still. It was the knowledge that dignity cannot be bought, that love without respect is no love at all. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting the quiet of the apartment surround me. The fight was over, the lies exposed, and the chains of silence shattered. Ahead lay days filled with choice and laughter, with books waiting to be read, and walks to be taken with a granddaughter who still believed I hung the moon. It is never too late to demand respect and freedom. I was 73 when I finally stood up, and it gave me a second life. What about you? If you were in my place, would you find the strength to rise?